The elk quarter hanging in the smokehouse had been there since late October. Now, in mid-April, it looked as fresh as the day it was hung. Thomas Merrick sliced off a thin piece with his knife, carefully examining its deep amber hue. He inhaled the rich, wood-smoke fragrance and ate it without a second thought. No mold, no spoilage, no rancid taste, just perfectly preserved meat after 6 months in a small log structure he had built himself. The 2 years leading up to that moment would completely change how mountain men survived the harsh Rockies winters. Thomas's discoveries would become whispered secrets at rendezvous gatherings for the next 3 decades. Before we get into the story, let us know where you're watching from. And if stories like this grab your attention, be sure to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode will be even more unbelievable. Thomas Merrick stood before his meat cache on a frozen January morning in 1835. He stared at what was supposed to be his lifeline through the remainder of winter. Instead, he was greeted by the sight of decay. The deer haunch he had meticulously salted and hung in October was now covered in a creeping green-black mold. The elk quarters, which he had dried with such confidence in November, were slimy to the touch. Beneath the surface, the flesh was spoiled beyond saving. Even the smaller cuts had an off-putting smell when he brought them close to his face. Thomas stood there for a long time, his breath forming white puffs in the bitter cold, trying to calculate just how badly he had failed himself. He likely had only 2 weeks of edible meat left, and winter in the Montana Rockies usually stretched into late April. Thomas Merrick had been trapping in the Rocky Mountains for 8 years. At 31, he was originally from Pennsylvania, where he had worked as an apprentice butcher before heading west in 1827. That background gave him a strong sense of confidence when it came to preserving meat. He understood salting, drying, and cold storage, having learned these techniques from a professional butcher. The problem was that butchering in town and preserving meat in the wilderness were 2 entirely different ballgames. Back in Pennsylvania, his mentor had worked in a dedicated smokehouse with carefully controlled conditions. Out in the mountains, Thomas was on his own, using whatever materials he could find, with meat that needed to last for months instead of days. Thomas cut away the spoiled portions, salvaging what little he could. The amount of waste was staggering. He estimated that he was throwing away more than 2/3 of what he had tried to preserve. The irony was almost unbearable. He had spent weeks that autumn hunting and processing this meat. The elk had nearly killed him during the hunt when it charged after his first shot missed its vital organs. Now, most of that elk was only good for scavengers. Thomas had relied on the preservation methods that were common knowledge among mountain men. Salt was the primary preservative, expensive but essential, and purchased at trading posts. He had thoroughly rubbed salt into every surface. For drying, he had hung the meat in the rafters of his cabin, where the heat from the fire would slowly dehydrate it. The results spoke for themselves, and they were not good. Thomas spent the rest of that January day hunting. By mid-afternoon, he found deer tracks and followed them into a thick stand of pine trees. The deer turned out to be a young doe. Thomas shot her cleanly, feeling no satisfaction, only relief. He field-dressed the carcass and hauled it back before dark. The entire process took him 3 hours, and he was exhausted by the time he arrived back at his cabin. This was what the next 3 months would likely look like. That night, Thomas sat by his fire, eating fresh venison. He had followed the generally accepted methods for meat preservation, techniques that other trappers claimed to use successfully. But it was clear that something was different, something was wrong. The winter of 1835 would not kill Thomas Merrick, but it would definitely change him. Somewhere in the sheer exhaustion of those months, a nagging question took root and refused to let go. If traditional methods were this unreliable, what would it actually take to preserve meat reliably? February in the Montana Rockies was the cruelest of months. The initial novelty of the deep winter snow had worn off, replaced by a grinding cold that seeped through every layer of clothing and turned simple tasks into exhausting chores. Thomas Merrick was now living day to day, hunting every other morning just to maintain enough fresh meat to keep himself going. His trap lines were suffering from neglect, which meant his income for the spring rendezvous was dwindling as he focused entirely on simply not starving. He had lost weight, probably 15 pounds from his already lean frame, and he could feel the difference in his strength and endurance. The mathematics of his situation were unforgiving. Thomas needed roughly 2 pounds of meat per day to maintain his body weight while doing the strenuous physical labor required for winter survival. Hunting every other day meant he needed to bring back at least 4 pounds each trip, accounting for waste and bones. That meant killing something substantial every 48 hours. Deer were scarce, wary, and increasingly difficult to find. As winter wore on, Thomas was spending entire days searching for game, burning calories he could barely afford to lose, gambling that he would find something before exhaustion forced him to return empty-handed. He had 3 close calls in February alone where he returned with nothing and had to ration his remaining meat down to portions that left him hungry and weak. The psychological toll was even worse than the physical deprivation. Thomas had always prided himself on his competence, his ability to thrive in an environment that regularly killed careless men. Now he was reduced to a state of constant anxiety about his next meal, second-guessing every decision, and wondering if he should abandon his trap lines entirely and move to a lower elevation where game might be more plentiful. He thought constantly about the spoiled meat he had thrown away in January. Each bite of fresh venison served as a painful reminder that he could be eating from a secure stockpile instead of gambling his survival on these daily hunts. By late February, Thomas had lost so much weight that he needed a new notch in his belt, and his ribs were clearly visible when he washed. He started avoiding looking at his reflection in the small mirror he kept for shaving. The face staring back at him was gaunt, with hollowed cheeks and eyes that had taken on a feverish intensity. He recognized the signs of malnutrition from having seen them in other trappers who had miscalculated their food supplies. The irony was that he was surrounded by potential food. But in the dead of winter, finding and killing that food required energy that he was quickly running out of. Thomas understood that he was approaching a critical point. He needed spring to arrive soon, or he needed to make a significant change in his strategy. On the last day of February, he made a decision that likely saved his life. He would stop trying to maintain his trap lines and focus exclusively on building up his meat supply before he became too weak to hunt effectively. The financial cost would be significant, but staying alive mattered far more than any profit. Spring finally arrived in late March with the grudging slowness typical of high-altitude Montana. Thomas Merrick had survived the winter, but just barely, and he carried the psychological scars of those months like physical wounds. He had lost nearly 25 pounds, taken dangerous risks hunting in conditions that should have killed him, and learned that competence meant nothing when your fundamental methods were flawed. As the snow melted and game returned to higher elevations, Thomas began eating regularly again and gradually regaining his strength. But something had fundamentally changed in how he thought about survival. He knew he could not endure another winter like the last one. That meant he needed to completely solve the meat preservation problem, and he needed to solve it before autumn arrived. Thomas spent May and June traveling between trapping camps, trading posts, and rendezvous sites, asking questions. He talked to French-Canadian voyageurs who had worked in the Northern Territories for decades. He spoke with American trappers who claimed to have perfected meat preservation. He listened to traders who dealt with preserved meat as a commodity. He even sought out conversations with Shoshone and Crow tribesmen who had been successfully preserving meat for generations before white trappers ever arrived in their territory. The education he received was both humbling and contradictory. Everyone had a method, and everyone claimed their method was superior, but the specifics varied wildly and often directly contradicted each other. The French-Canadian voyageurs emphasized smoking over extended periods, sometimes weeks, using specific hardwoods that they claimed were essential. One grizzled old voyager named Baptiste told Thomas that green hickory was the only wood worth using, and that meat needed to hang in smoke for at least 30 days to be truly preserved. An American trapper from Kentucky insisted that salt curing was the primary method and that smoking was merely for flavor, claiming he could keep meat edible for 6 months with nothing but salt and cold storage. A Shoshone man, Thomas, met near a trading post on the Yellowstone River, explained, through broken English and hand gestures, that his people dried meat in thin strips over low fires, creating something as hard as leather that would last indefinitely if kept dry. Thomas started making mental notes, trying to identify common principles underlying the varying techniques. Everyone agreed that moisture was the enemy. Spoilage occurred when meat stayed wet, allowing mold and rot to take hold. Everyone agreed that salt helped, though opinions varied on how much to use and how to apply it. Most people mentioned smoke as being important, though again the specifics differed widely. Temperature came up frequently, but in a vague way. Too hot, and the meat cooked instead of preserving. Too cold, and the preservation process slowed or stopped. Thomas realized that successful preservation wasn't about following one person's recipe. It was about understanding the underlying principles and then applying them systematically in his specific conditions. Nobody could give him a simple answer because preservation depended on dozens of variables that changed with location, climate, and available materials. He would need to experiment, test, and refine his own method. The thought was daunting, but also strangely exciting. Thomas had always been good at solving practical problems. Now, he had a problem truly worth solving. Thomas spent late July and early August of 1835 building his first smokehouse. He chose a location 30 yards from his main cabin, near a small creek that provided water for mixing clay chinking. The design was simple, borrowed from descriptions he had gathered during his spring research. He constructed a rectangular structure approximately 6 feet wide, 8 feet deep, and 7 feet tall at the peak. The walls were made of horizontal logs notched at the corners, similar to cabin construction, but smaller in scale. He intentionally left gaps between some of the logs to allow smoke to circulate, though he was mostly guessing at how much ventilation would be optimal. The floor was packed earth, and in the center, he dug a shallow pit for his fire. Thomas reasoned that keeping the fire inside the structure would maximize smoke exposure and minimize heat loss. He installed 2 levels of wooden racks made from green willow branches, one at shoulder height and another near the roof peak. The door was simple, made from split logs bound together with leather strips, designed to close tightly but not seal completely. The roof was made of bark and pine boughs, angled to shed rain. The entire construction took him 6 days, working alone. In mid-August, he killed a mule deer and used it as his first test subject. He butchered the deer carefully, creating cuts similar to what he had seen described by the voyagers. He salted the meat liberally and let it sit overnight to draw out moisture. The next morning, he hung the cuts in his new smokehouse, started a fire using cottonwood, and began the smoking process. The problems quickly became apparent within hours. The fire pit on the ground created too much direct heat. The meat on the lower racks was cooking rather than smoking, the fat rendering out and dripping into the fire. Thomas tried reducing the fire size, but then smoke production dropped and the temperature fell too low to have any preservation effect. He experimented with fire placement, moving coals around the pit, trying to find a balance between heat and smoke. By the 3rd day, the meat on the lower rack was overcooked on the outside but still raw inside. The meat on the upper rack looked better, but when he checked it after a week, mold was growing on several pieces. The humidity from the ground and the inconsistent temperature had created the perfect conditions for spoilage. Thomas cut his losses after 10 days. Most of the test batch was ruined. A few pieces from the upper rack were salvageable, but they weren't properly preserved, just partially smoked meat that would need to be eaten within days. The disappointment was crushing. He had invested a significant amount of time and effort into this structure, and it had failed miserably. Thomas sat outside his failed smokehouse on a warm August evening, trying to understand what had gone wrong. He had built a structure without truly understanding the processes that structure needed to support. Smoke alone was not enough. Temperature control was critical, and he had none. Moisture was destroying his meat despite the smoke. He needed to understand why preservation worked before he could build something that actually preserved meat. Thomas didn't abandon his smokehouse. Instead, he began treating it as a laboratory for systematic experimentation. Throughout September and October of 1835, he tested variables methodically, changing one element at a time and carefully observing the results. He killed rabbits and other small game for these experiments, creatures that required less investment than deer or elk, but still provided meaningful test subjects for preservation techniques. Each test taught him something, even when it failed, and slowly a coherent understanding began to emerge from the chaos of contradictory advice he had gathered earlier. Temperature was the first major breakthrough. Thomas discovered through painful trial and error that meat preservation required a narrow temperature range. If it was too hot, above roughly 120 degrees Fahrenheit, the meat cooked. If it was too cold, below 70 degrees, the smoking process became ineffective at preventing spoilage. The ideal range seemed to be between 80 and 100 degrees, warm enough to dry the meat gradually, while cool enough to avoid cooking it. Maintaining that range with a ground-level fire pit was nearly impossible because the fire temperature fluctuated wildly depending on the type of wood, the size of the fire, and the airflow. Thomas realized he needed to separate the fire source from the meat chamber, allowing the smoke to cool slightly before it reached the hanging meat. Wood selection was the second critical discovery. Thomas tested cottonwood, willow, pine, juniper, and aspen, the woods most readily available in his territory. Each produced different results. Pine created a harsh smoke that made the meat taste bitter and did little to prevent spoilage. Cottonwood burned too hot and produced minimal smoke. Willow was better, creating a mild smoke and moderate heat, but the preservation effect was inconsistent. Juniper produced the best results, creating an aromatic smoke that seemed to actively discourage mold growth. The meat smoked over juniper stayed fresh, noticeably longer than meat smoked over other woods. Thomas began stockpiling juniper specifically for smoking purposes. Moisture control emerged as the third essential element. Thomas noticed that meat hung during humid periods spoiled faster, regardless of smoke exposure. He began monitoring weather patterns and learned to recognize conditions that favored preservation versus conditions that encouraged rot. Clear, dry days with low humidity were ideal for starting the smoking process. Foggy or rainy periods required either delaying preservation or compensating with longer smoking duration. He also discovered that pre-salting the meat and allowing it to sit for 24 hours before smoking was essential. The salt drew moisture out of the meat tissue, creating a drier surface that the smoke could penetrate more effectively. Hanging height became the fourth variable Thomas mastered. He discovered that different positions inside the smokehouse created different temperature zones. Meat hung near the roof peak was too hot. Meat hung too low was too cool and collected condensation. The optimal zone was roughly 4 feet above the fire source, high enough to avoid direct heat, but low enough to receive consistent smoke. Thomas began arranging meat carefully by cut type, placing larger pieces in cooler zones and smaller pieces where the temperature was slightly higher. By late October, Thomas had accumulated enough knowledge to attempt a complete redesign. Winter was rapidly approaching, and he had one chance to get this right. Thomas began construction of his second smokehouse in early November of 1836. Every element of this design incorporated lessons from his year of experimentation, and every decision was deliberate rather than a mere guess. He chose a location on slightly elevated ground to ensure proper drainage and prevent ground moisture from accumulating inside the structure. The site had good air circulation but was protected from the prevailing winds that could make temperature control difficult. He spent 2 full days just selecting and preparing the location before even cutting a single log. The structure itself was smaller than his first attempt, only 5 feet wide by 6 feet deep, but taller at 9 feet to the roof peak. Thomas built the walls from carefully selected logs, each one straight and uniform in diameter to create tight fits at the corners. He used traditional notching but added wooden pins driven through the corners to prevent any shifting or separation. Between each log, he packed a mixture of clay, dried grass, and animal hair, which he had learned created a superior chinking compared to plain mud. This mixture dried hard but remained slightly flexible, preventing cracks from forming as the wood settled. The critical innovation was the raised floor. Thomas constructed a platform of split logs 18 inches above the ground, supported by corner posts sunk deep into the earth. This elevation served multiple purposes. It prevented ground moisture from affecting the meat, improved air circulation underneath the structure, and, most importantly, allowed him to build his fire pit beneath the raised floor rather than inside the meat chamber. Thomas dug a shallow pit directly under the center of the raised floor and lined it with flat stones to contain the fire and reflect heat upward. He cut a small opening in the raised floor directly above the fire pit, just large enough to allow smoke to rise into the meat chamber, but small enough to prevent excessive heat transfer. The smoke would rise through the floor opening, fill the chamber where the meat hung, and exit through an adjustable vent hole Thomas built into the roof peak. By controlling the size of the roof vent, he could regulate how quickly the smoke escaped, which, in turn, controlled the temperature and smoke density inside the chamber. A larger vent opening meant faster smoke circulation and a lower temperature. A smaller opening meant slower circulation and a higher temperature. Thomas could adjust the conditions based on the weather, the meat type, and the stage of the smoking process. Inside the chamber, Thomas installed 3 levels of hanging racks made from juniper branches, positioned at 3 feet, 5 feet, and 7 feet above the raised floor. This gave him distinct temperature zones. The lowest rack received the most heat and the densest smoke. The middle rack was the optimal zone for most meat. The highest rack was coolest and best for long-term storage of already smoked meat. The door was constructed from thick planks with leather hinges and a simple wooden latch that sealed tightly but could be opened easily for monitoring. Thomas stood back and examined his work. After 12 days of construction, the smokehouse looked professional, almost elegant in its simplicity. Every element had a purpose, and every purpose was based on knowledge he had earned through failure. Now came the test that really mattered. Could this design actually preserve meat for 6 months? Thomas killed a bull elk in late October of 1836, a massive animal that provided nearly 300 pounds of usable meat. This would be his comprehensive test of the new smokehouse design. He butchered the elk methodically, creating cuts of various sizes to test how different thicknesses responded to the smoking process. Large haunches, medium roasts, smaller steaks, and thin strips would each hang in the smokehouse and either prove or disprove his method over the coming months. He salted every piece heavily, rubbing coarse salt into all surfaces, then let the meat sit in his cabin overnight while the salt drew out moisture. The next morning, Thomas loaded the smokehouse carefully. Large cuts went on the middle rack where the temperature was most stable. Medium pieces filled the lower rack where the heat was slightly higher. The upper rack remained empty for now, reserved for meat that had already completed its initial smoking. He started his fire using seasoned juniper wood, keeping the flames small and controlled. Smoke began rising through the floor opening within minutes, filling the packed chamber with fragrant white smoke. Thomas adjusted the roof vent until the smoke flowed steadily but not rapidly, creating the circulation pattern he wanted. The temperature inside the chamber stabilized around 90 degrees, exactly where he needed it. For the first week, Thomas monitored the smokehouse constantly. He checked the temperature multiple times daily by simply placing his hand inside and gauging the heat. He adjusted the fire size and roof vent opening based on the weather conditions. Cold nights required slightly larger fires. Warm afternoons required opening the vent wider to prevent overheating. He rotated the meat pieces occasionally to ensure even smoke exposure. After 7 days, the meat had developed a dark mahogany color and a firm texture. Thomas moved the large cuts to the upper rack and started a new batch of fresh meat on the middle rack. The process was working beautifully. By mid-November, Thomas had smoked his entire elk supply. The smokehouse was full, the racks loaded with dark, aromatic meat that showed no signs of spoilage. He began the waiting period that would truly test his method. He cut small samples weekly to check for any deterioration. Throughout November and December, the meat remained perfect. January brought the coldest temperatures of the winter, and still the meat showed no mold, no off smells, and no degradation. February and March passed with the same results. Thomas was eating from his smoke supply regularly now, and every piece was as good as the day it had finished smoking. April arrived, and Thomas approached his smokehouse with a mixture of excitement and disbelief. 6 months had passed since he had smoked the first cuts from that October elk. He cut a thick slice from one of the original haunches, the piece that had hung the longest. The meat was firm, dry on the surface, but not desiccated. The color was deep brown, almost black in places from the concentrated smoke. Thomas smelled it carefully, detecting only juniper smoke and the rich aroma of preserved meat. He ate the slice slowly, and it was perfect. It wasn't fresh meat, certainly, but it was completely preserved, safe, nutritious, and edible. Thomas had succeeded. His method worked absolutely. He had solved the problem that had nearly killed him 14 months earlier. Thomas attended the summer rendezvous of 1837 with quiet confidence. He brought smoked meat samples that had been preserved for 8 months, offering them to other trappers without explanation. Men tasted the meat, asked questions about his methods, and Thomas answered honestly. He had no reason to keep his techniques a secret. The knowledge had saved his life, and he saw no benefit in hoarding it while other men struggled with the same problems he had faced. Word spread quickly through the gathering. Thomas Merrick had built a smokehouse that actually worked, and he was willing to explain how. The initial response was skepticism mixed with interest. Experienced trappers had seen many claimed innovations for years. Most of those attempts failed when put to the test under actual field conditions. Thomas had anticipated this outcome and simply extended an invitation to anyone with doubts, urging them to visit his camp and personally inspect his smokehouse. A dozen men accepted his offer. Over the subsequent weeks, Thomas meticulously walked them through every aspect of his design, thoroughly explaining the reasoning behind each element and patiently addressing their questions. Some visitors immediately grasped the effectiveness of his method. Others remained unconvinced, but were willing to give building similar structures a try. Still others dismissed the whole idea as requiring too much effort for an uncertain payoff. By the autumn of 1837, Thomas was aware of at least 5 other trappers who had constructed smokehouses based on his design. 2 of them had created precise replicas, adhering strictly to his instructions. The other 3 had modified the design, either due to a lack of specific materials or because they believed they could enhance his method. The results that winter proved to be a mixed bag. The 2 trappers who had faithfully followed Thomas's design reported unqualified success. Their meat was preserved perfectly, and they sent messages through mutual acquaintances expressing their gratitude and amazement. The 3 who had altered the design experienced only partial success, at best. One trapper had built his smokehouse on level ground instead of elevated terrain and consequently struggled with moisture issues. Another had substituted pine wood for juniper, as pine was more readily available, which resulted in his meat developing an unpleasant, bitter taste. The third had attempted to cut down on construction time by skimping on the quality of the chinking, causing his smokehouse to lose heat rapidly. As a result, maintaining the proper temperature required burning through his wood supply at an unsustainable pace. Upon hearing these reports, Thomas felt a sense of frustration mixed with recognition. These men were repeating the same mistake he had made initially, assuming that the general concept was sufficient without truly understanding the importance of the specific details. Thomas dedicated the summer of 1838 to teaching with greater care and precision. When trappers inquired about his smokehouse, he no longer simply described what to build, but also thoroughly explained why each element was so important. He emphasized that taking shortcuts typically led to failure and that the additional effort invested during construction would yield significant benefits during the winter months. Some men listened attentively and went on to build successful smokehouses. Others continued to seek out easier methods and continued to encounter inconsistent results. By 1839, the expression Merrick Smokehouse was being used at rendezvous gatherings to describe the elevated, ventilated design that actually preserved meat dependably. Thomas never sought recognition or tried to capitalize on his innovation, but his name became associated with it simply because he was widely known as the person who had solved the meat preservation problem. Other trappers further refined and adapted his basic design, creating regional variations that were effective in different climates and at varying elevations, but the underlying principles remained unchanged. By 1840, the techniques that Thomas Merrick had developed were spreading beyond the trapper community and into the broader frontier population. Settlers moving westward into the Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho territories encountered trappers utilizing Merrick-style smokehouses and immediately recognized their value. Unlike itinerant trappers who might abandon a structure after a single season, settlers were establishing permanent homesteads and required dependable food preservation methods for their families. The investment of time and materials required to build a proper smokehouse was a worthwhile endeavor when that structure would serve a family for years or even decades. Trading posts began stocking materials specifically for smokehouse construction. Iron hardware for hinges and latches, which Thomas had previously scavenged or improvised, became readily available for purchase. Clay suitable for chinking was sold by the barrel. Detailed instructions for construction appeared in frontier newspapers and in guidebooks written for immigrants heading west. The design continued to evolve as it spread, incorporating regional materials and adapting to local conditions. In areas where juniper was scarce, builders discovered that hickory, apple, or cherry wood produced excellent results. In extremely cold climates, some builders incorporated double-wall construction for improved insulation. In areas with heavy rainfall, roof designs became more elaborate to ensure complete waterproofing. The United States Army took an interest in the preservation methods around 1842. Frontier forts required reliable meat storage for their garrisons, and standard military supply chains were often inadequate in remote territories. Several fort commanders ordered the construction of large smokehouses based on the Merrick design, scaled up to handle the meat requirements of 50 to 100 soldiers. These military smokehouses proved to be so successful that the Army included detailed construction specifications in their frontier operations manuals. Officers trained in proper smokehouse design carried that knowledge to new postings across the expanding Western territories. Commercial meat operations started employing similar techniques by the late 1840s. As towns grew in the Mountain West, professional butchers needed preservation methods capable of handling large quantities of meat. The principles that Thomas had discovered for personal survival scaled effectively to commercial operations. Urban smokehouses in Denver, Salt Lake City, and other frontier towns utilized elevated construction, separate fire chambers, and controlled ventilation to produce preserved meat that could be sold months after processing. The economic impact was substantial, enabling seasonal hunting and butchering to support year-round meat supplies. Indigenous communities also adopted elements of the design. Tribes that had traditionally relied on simple drying methods recognized the advantages of the controlled smoking process, particularly for trading preserved meat to settlers and military posts. Some tribal groups built hybrid structures that combined traditional drying techniques with the temperature control and smoke circulation principles from Merrick-style smokehouses. The result was preserved meat that satisfied both traditional tastes and the practical requirement for extended storage. By 1850, variations of Thomas Merrick's smokehouse design could be found throughout the Rocky Mountain region and beyond. The precise number was impossible to determine, but evidence suggests that hundreds of structures were based directly or indirectly on his original innovation. Most builders never knew Thomas's name or his story. They simply learned the technique from someone who had learned it from someone else, the knowledge spreading organically because it effectively addressed a genuine need. Thomas himself had transitioned away from active trapping by this time, opting for a more settled lifestyle, but his legacy continued to grow even without his direct involvement. Thomas Merrick left the mountains in 1844 at the age of 40. The fur trade was collapsing as beaver populations dwindled and fashion trends shifted away from felt hats and towards silk. Thomas had saved money during his prosperous years and used it to purchase land in the Bitterroot Valley of western Montana, where he established a small ranch. He married a widow named Sarah, who had journeyed west with a wagon train and lost her husband to cholera. They had 2 children together and raised Sarah's daughter from her first marriage. Thomas became a quiet member of a growing frontier community, known as a competent rancher and an occasional hunting guide, but he rarely spoke about his years as a mountain man. In 1856, Thomas encountered a young homesteader named William constructing a smokehouse on adjacent property. Thomas observed for a few moments before recognizing his own design in the elevated floor and separated fire chamber. He approached William, introduced himself, and inquired where he had learned the technique. William explained that his father had built a similar smokehouse in Wyoming Territory 5 years earlier after learning the method from a trapper at a trading post. The young man had no idea that he was speaking to the person who had originally developed the design. Thomas felt a strange mixture of pride and insignificance. His innovation had become anonymous knowledge, passed along without attribution, which was precisely how useful ideas should spread. Thomas offered a few suggestions regarding roof ventilation based on the specific wind patterns in that location. William thanked him and incorporated the advice. The smokehouse performed admirably that winter, and William told neighbors that an old rancher named Merrick had assisted him with the design, never grasping the deeper significance of the name. Thomas found satisfaction in this anonymous contribution. He had solved a problem, freely shared the solution, and witnessed it improve lives across an entire region. That was enough for him. Thomas passed away in 1868 at the age of 64, following a stroke that left him partially paralyzed for the final 3 months of his life. He was buried in a small cemetery outside Stevensville, Montana. His gravestone listed his name, birth year, and death year, along with the inscription, "Beloved husband and father." There was no mention of his years in the mountains or the innovation that had carried his name across the frontier. His family was aware that he had been a trapper, but they had little understanding of his specific accomplishments. To them, he was simply a good man who had built a stable life after a difficult past. However, across Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, and beyond, smokehouses built upon Thomas Merrick's principles continued to function. Some were still original structures from the 1830s and 1840s, weathered but sound, their elevated floors and ventilation systems as effective as the day they were built. Others were newer constructions, built by people who had learned the technique secondhand or thirdhand. The knowledge had been simplified and adapted, but it remained fundamentally sound. The phrase "built like a Merrick smokehouse" became frontier shorthand for construction that was durable and functioned reliably. Thomas Merrick had started with a simple need to survive the winter. He ended up changing how thousands of people preserved food across the American frontier. His innovation required no new technology, just careful observation, systematic experimentation, and a willingness to share what he had learned. That was his enduring legacy.